It was still drying on Gabriel Dragon's knuckles when he unlocked the door to his penthouse and knew, before he even turned on the lights, that something was wrong. The silence was too complete. He had just come from a warehouse where two men would never walk again. A turf dispute settled the only way his world understood, with fist and threats. He was still wearing that night on his skin, the copper smell, the adrenaline that hadn't yet drained out of his hands. He wanted a shower. He wanted silence. He wanted his wife asleep in the other room, the way she always was, curled at the far edge of the bed, like she was trying to take up as little space in his life as possible. Instead, he got silence of a different kind. The closet doors were open, empty hangers swung slightly, as if someone had rushed. Nora's perfume bottle, the one she kept on the dresser, was gone. Her side of the bathroom, toothbrush, hair ties, the small stack of paperback novels she thought he didn't notice her reading, all gone. No note, no text message, no goodbye, just one single brass key, sitting alone in the center of the stripped mattress, catching the moonlight like it was mocking him. Gabriel Dragon did not panic. Panic was a language he'd forgotten years ago, beaten out of him long before he inherited his father's empire. What rose in him instead was something colder and far more dangerous, rage laced with humiliation. Nobody left Don Dragon. Not rivals, not traitors, not even fear itself, and certainly not a quiet, unremarkable wife he'd married 3 years ago to settle a debt, a woman he barely spoke 10 sentences to a week. He picked up his phone before the anger even finished rising in his chest. "Find her," he said, voice flat as stone. "Now." By sunrise, his network, men in traffic booths, hackers monitoring bank cards, a bribed clerk at the DMV, had done what they always did. They found her in 6 hours. Not across the country, not hiding in some safe house. She was 4 miles away, in the arts district, working behind the counter of a small floral shop, with hand-painted letters on the window that read, "Petal and Stem." 4 miles. She hadn't even bothered to run far. That insult burned hotter than anything else. He arrived just as the morning light spilled gold across the cracked sidewalk, his black car pulling up like a shadow against the pastel storefronts of the block. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He didn't bring his usual escort of armed men. Some primal instinct told him this needed to be handled alone, quietly, before his fury did something permanent. The bell above the shop door rang softly as he stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Lilies, fresh-cut roses, damp soil. A world so far from blood and gunmetal, it almost felt like walking into someone else's memory. And there she was. Nora stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, trimming stems with quick, practiced hands, tucking baby's breath into a bouquet of white peonies. Her hair was different, shorter, lighter, pulled back loosely instead of the tight, careful style she always wore for him. She looked lighter, freer, like a woman who had never spent 3 years flinching at the sound of a closing door. He stormed past a startled customer toward the back room, grabbing her wrist hard enough to make the scissors clatter onto the counter. "Do you have any idea," he growled, low and dangerous, "what you just did?" He expected tears. He expected fear, or defiance, or that same familiar coldness she always gave him. Instead, Nora looked at him with wide, startled, but strangely calm eyes. Not the eyes of a wife caught running from her husband. The eyes of someone meeting a stranger. "I'm sorry," she said gently, carefully pulling her wrist free, glancing at his grip like it belonged to an over-eager customer rather than the man she'd shared a bed with for 3 years. "Were you in line? I can help you right now. Are you looking for something specific? We have a beautiful arrangement of white peonies, or if you'd prefer something bolder, I have deep red." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Nora, stop this." Whatever game you're playing. I'm sorry, she said again, softer this time, almost embarrassed for him, like he was confusing her with somebody else. Have we met before? You seem to know my name, but I don't think I… She stopped herself, tilting her head, studying his face the way you'd study a word on the tip of your tongue that refused to surface. I'm so sorry, she said finally, and for the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Not memory, but the vague, uneasy shadow of an absence where memory should be. I don't know who you are. The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. Gabriel Dragan, a man who controlled half the ports in Chicago, who had buried enemies and built an empire from nothing but violence and will, stood frozen in a flower shop that smelled like peace, staring at his own wife. And for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Gabriel didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car outside the flower shop for nearly 2 hours after Nora had gently, apologetically, asked him to leave, the way you'd ask a lost stranger to stop loitering near your register. Every replay of her blank, polite face made something twist harder in his chest. Amnesia didn't happen by accident. Not conveniently, not 4 miles from home, with no accident report, no hospital record, no trace of trauma on her body. Someone had done this to her, and Gabriel intended to find out who. He didn't believe for a second she'd forgotten on her own. People like Nora didn't run from marriages like his. They endured them, silently, until the day they died or he let them go. So someone else had made this happen, a rival, someone trying to humiliate him by stealing his wife's mind instead of her body. By midnight, one of his men, a jittery, overpaid informant named Wexler, who moved information the way other men move drugs, gave him a name, a black market clinic operating 3 floors beneath an abandoned dry cleaning business in the industrial stretch near the river. Memory alteration, illegal, unregulated, and, according to whispers in the underworld, disturbingly effective. Gabriel didn't bring an army. He brought 2 men, a crowbar and a gun he didn't plan on using unless he had to. The sub-basement smelled like antiseptic and old concrete, steel doors, humming machines. A waiting room with plastic chairs that looked stolen from a bus station, and behind a reinforced door, a lab that looked like it belonged in a hospital 20 years more advanced than anything legal. The head technician, a thin, nervous man named Dr. Albrecht, with glasses too big for his face, nearly fainted when Gabriel kicked the door open. "Whoever hired you to touch my wife's mind," Gabriel said, slamming him against a metal cabinet, voice a low growl, "is going to wish they'd never been born. Give me a name." I don't understand," Albrecht stammered. "Nobody hired anyone. She came in herself. She signed the forms herself." Gabriel's grip tightened. "Don't lie to me. I'm not lying. Check the files. She's a legal client. Everything was consensual, documented, recorded. Something in the man's terror felt too genuine to be a lie. Gabriel released him, chest heaving, and gestured toward the computer terminal. "Show me." What followed felt like a slow unraveling of every certainty Gabriel had built his life on. The file was real. Nora's signature, dated 2 weeks before her disappearance, on a consent form for targeted episodic memory suppression, spousal relationship, marked severe distress. Payment confirmed, session logged. And then a video file, time-stamped 11 days ago. Albrecht, hands shaking, clicked play. On the screen, Nora sat in a small gray room, hands folded in her lap, the calm, quiet posture Gabriel recognized from 1,000 silent dinners. But her eyes were different here, tired in a way he had never let himself notice before. Exhausted, not from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. "I don't want to remember him," she said softly, to someone off camera. Not the way things have been. 3 years of nothing. Cold rooms, cold silences. I used to think if I just tried harder, he'd eventually look at me like I existed, but he never did. And I would rather lose every memory of loving him than keep carrying the pain of being invisible to someone I share a bed with. She paused, twisting her fingers together. I know this is extreme. I know people will say I'm running from my problems instead of solving them, but I've tried talking. I've tried waiting. I've tried disappearing into silence, hoping he'd notice I was drowning. He never did. This isn't revenge. I want a version of me that never learned to be afraid of a man's footsteps in a hallway. The video ended. Gabriel stood motionless, the crowbar loose and forgotten in his hand. There had been no rival, no kidnapping, no enemy stealing his wife to wound him. He had done this. His silence, his coldness. 3 years of treating her like an obligation instead of a person, an arrangement instead of a wife, had broken something in her so completely that she chose a stranger's blank memory over a lifetime beside him. He had built an empire on being feared. He had never once considered what it meant to be feared by the one person who was supposed to be safe with him. She didn't want it undone, Albrecht said carefully, watching Gabriel's face with visible fear. She was very clear. Whatever you're planning to do to me, I only gave a desperate woman what she asked for. Gabriel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier violence, hollowed out into something quieter, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. Can it be reversed? Theoretically. Forced recall under extreme neurological stimulus, trauma, shock, specific triggers tied to the suppressed memories. But it's dangerous, and never guaranteed. And, Albrecht hesitated, if you force it against her will, you're no better than the man she paid me to help her forget. The words landed like a slap. Gabriel stepped back, lowering the crowbar completely, some old, brutal instinct in him losing its grip for the first time in years. He'd walked in, ready to burn the clinic down, ready to make someone pay for stealing his wife. He walked out instead with the terrible, humbling understanding that the only person who had ever truly stolen anything from Nora was him. 3 years of her life, her spirit, her ability to trust. He didn't touch Albrecht. He didn't touch the files. He simply turned, walked past his stunned men without a word, and drove back toward the city as dawn broke over the skyline, carrying a weight far heavier than any gun he'd ever held. For the first time since inheriting his father's empire, Gabriel Dragon understood exactly what kind of monster he had become. And somewhere across the city, in a small apartment above a flower shop, Nora slept peacefully, free, for the first time in 3 years, of a man she no longer remembered breaking her. For 3 days, Gabriel Dragon did something he had never done in his adult life. He did nothing. No meetings, no calls to his lieutenants, no decisions about shipments or turf, or the dozen small fires that always needed his hand to put out. He sat in his penthouse, staring at the space where Nora's belongings used to be, replaying her voice from that video file until the words wore grooves into his mind. I would rather lose every memory of loving him than keep carrying the pain of being invisible. He could storm back into that flower shop and demand she come home. He had the power to do it. A phone call, a threat, a favor called in from a judge who owed him. But some new, unfamiliar part of him understood that dragging her back would only prove her right. It would confirm every reason she'd had for running. So on the 4th day, Gabriel Dragon did something far more dangerous than any raid he'd ever led. He rented an apartment, not through his usual channels. No lawyers, no shell companies, no paper trail leading back to Dragon Holdings. A small, unremarkable one-bedroom in Oak Park, directly across the street from Nora's new building, leased under a name nobody in his world had ever heard. Gabe Reyes. He paid the deposit in cash, signed with a fake but convincing ID one of his forgers had built in an afternoon, and moved in with 2 suitcases instead of an armed convoy. The tailored suits stayed in his closet downtown. He wore jeans that first day, actual jeans, stiff and unfamiliar against his legs, a plain gray hoodie, and scuffed sneakers instead of the Italian leather he usually favored. He left his watch, worth more than most people's cars, locked in a drawer. He told his men, all of them baffled into silence, that he was unreachable except in true emergencies. Julian, his second-in-command, had simply stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had, but for once losing his mind felt like the only sane thing left to do. The first morning, he walked to the coffee shop on the corner, the same one he'd learned from Wexler's surveillance notes that Nora visited every day before opening her shop. He sat 2 tables away, nursing a coffee he didn't even like, watching her order the same drink, laugh softly at something the barista said, tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear with the casual ease of someone completely unburdened. She had never laughed like that around him, not once in 3 years. He didn't approach her that day, or the next. He simply watched, learning things about his own wife he'd never bothered to notice before. That she took her coffee with too much cream, that she always left a generous tip, that she hummed quietly under her breath while she waited for her order. On the 3rd morning, he let it happen naturally. He timed his exit from the shop just as she stepped out, with 2 heavy crates of fresh tulips balanced awkwardly against her hip, struggling to keep them steady while holding the door. "Let me help with that," he said, stepping forward before he could talk himself out of it. Nora glanced up, startled, then smiled. An easy, unguarded smile that had nothing wary or careful in it. "Oh, thank you. They're heavier than they look." He took the crates from her without thinking, without performing strength the way he usually did in rooms full of men who needed reminding who was in charge. He simply carried them because she needed help, and because for the first time in years, nobody was watching him to see if he looked weak. "I'm Gabe," he said, testing the borrowed name on his tongue. It felt strange. It also, unexpectedly, felt like relief. "Nora," she said, walking beside him toward the shop. "You're new around here, aren't you? I would have noticed you at the coffee shop before. Just moved in. Across the street, actually." He nodded toward his building. "Small world," she said, pushing open the shop door, gesturing for him to set the crates by the counter. "Well, thank you, Gabe. Most people just hold doors and pretend not to notice someone struggling." "I noticed," he said simply. Something in the quiet honesty of it made her pause, studying him for a moment, longer than necessary, the way you study something familiar you can't quite place. Over the following days, their conversations grew slowly, carefully, like something being rebuilt from nothing. Gabe, learned to ask questions instead of issuing statements. He learned to listen to her answer fully before responding, instead of already planning his next move the way he did in every negotiation, every deal, every conversation that mattered in his old world. He learned that she'd always wanted to open her own flower shop, ever since she was a little girl arranging wildflowers on her family's farm. He learned she liked rain, hated confrontation, and had a habit of biting the inside of her cheek when she was nervous. He learned these things not because he demanded them, but because she offered them freely, the way people do when they feel safe. He had been married to this woman for 3 years, and had never once earned that kind of trust. Every evening, Gabriel returned to his small rented apartment, sat by the window, and watched the light in her apartment across the street flicker on and off as she moved through her small, simple life. He thought of the man he used to be, the one who barked orders instead of asking questions, who ruled through fear because it was easier than vulnerability, who had never once, in 3 years of marriage, learned how to hold a conversation without asserting dominance. Gabe Reyes was teaching him how. And somewhere in the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of borrowed coffee orders and flower crates, Gabriel Dragan felt something dangerous stir in his chest. Not the hunger for control that had defined his entire life, but something softer, more fragile, and far more terrifying. He was starting to fall in love with his own wife, as if for the very first time. The only problem was, sooner or later, the empire he'd built on blood and fear would come looking for the man who had disappeared from it, and it would not wait forever. Empires do not run on autopilot. Gabriel Dragan understood this better than anyone. He had spent his entire adult life proving that an organization was only as strong as the fear its leader inspired. And fear, unlike love, required constant maintenance. For 3 weeks, that maintenance had stopped. Julian Voss had covered for him as long as he could. He rescheduled meetings, invented excuses, told the capos that Don Dragan was handling something sensitive. Whenever they asked why the man who once answered his phone within 2 rings now went dark for days at a time. But lieutenants noticed silence, the way sharks noticed blood in the water, and rivals noticed it faster. Valeria Kane had been circling the edges of Dragan territory for over a year, patient and calculating in a way most of Gabriel's enemies never bothered to be. She ran a smaller but ruthlessly efficient syndicate out of the north side, and she had spent months testing the waters of his operation. Small thefts, minor disrespect, probing questions passed through corrupted contacts. Every time, Gabriel had answered decisively, reminding her exactly why nobody crossed Dragan territory twice. But decisive answers required a decisive man, and the man currently answering to the name Gabe hadn't set foot in his own boardroom in 19 days. It was Valeria's informant, a low-level dock worker Julian had failed to properly vet, who first noticed the pattern: container shipments delayed without explanation, enforcers standing idle without direct orders. A Don who used to personally inspect every high-value shipment, now completely, suspiciously invisible. "Something's wrong with Dragan," the informant reported. "He's gone soft, or gone missing, or both." Valeria didn't wait for confirmation. She struck that same night. Gabriel was 3 bites into a quiet dinner with Nora, a small Italian place 2 blocks from her apartment, candlelight flickering between them, her laughter still echoing in his ears from a joke he'd made about the waiter's dramatic wine presentation, when his burner phone buzzed against his thigh with a message that turned his blood to ice. "Docks are burning. Emergency. Come now." He excused himself with a hastily invented story about a work call, kissed Nora's forehead, a gesture so natural now it startled him, and walked out into the night as Gabe Reyes. By the time he reached his car 3 blocks away, he was already peeling off that identity like a second skin, becoming, with terrifying speed, the man he'd been trying to bury. The docks were an inferno by the time he arrived. Orange flames licked against the black Chicago sky, reflecting off the dark water in long, wavering streaks. 2 entire shipping containers had been detonated, their contents, weapons, counterfeit goods, and enough laundered cash to fund a small war, reduced to ash and twisted metal. His men ran in chaotic circles, shouting contradictory orders, nobody in command, because the only man they answered to had been 3 weeks absent, learning how to carry flower crates. Julian met him at the perimeter, soot streaked across his face, fury and relief warring in his expression. "Where the hell have you been?" Julian demanded, voice cracking with a rare loss of composure. "Valeria hit us with everything. 2 docks gone, 6 men gone. She's been planning this for weeks, and you weren't here to stop it." Gabriel didn't answer right away. He stared at the wreckage, at the blood-slick concrete, the bodies of men he had once trained personally, the smoking ruins of an empire his father had built and he had sworn to protect. Something cold and familiar reasserted itself in his chest. The old Gabriel, the Dawn. "Get me a location on Valeria," he said, voice flat, dangerous, final. Tonight. For the rest of the night, Gabriel Dragon became a machine of controlled violence. He personally interrogated the surviving guards who had let the docks fall, dismissing 2 on the spot, and promoting a 3rd who had fought until he ran out of ammunition. He redistributed weapons, doubled security at every remaining warehouse, and sent a message through back channels that would reach Valeria by morning, a message written not in words, but in the brutal, efficient reclamation of everything she'd tried to take. By sunrise, the fires were extinguished, the docks partially secured, and Don Dragon's reputation stitched back together through sheer force of will. But something had shifted, and Gabriel felt it the moment he finally allowed himself to breathe. His hands, steady through years of violence, trembled faintly as he climbed back into his car. Not from fear of Valeria, not from the carnage he'd just walked through, from the memory of Nora's face across candlelight, laughing softly, utterly unaware that the man beside her had just left to reclaim an empire built on the same coldness that had driven her away from him in the first place. He drove back to Oak Park as dawn broke, showered away the smoke and ash, and forced his hands to stop shaking before knocking gently on Nora's door to explain his absence with another careful lie about work emergencies. She accepted it easily, trustingly, tracing worried fingers over the faint bruise on his knuckles he hadn't managed to fully hide. "You should be more careful," she murmured, gently pressing a cool cloth against his hand. "Whatever it is you do, if only she knew." That night, alone in his rented apartment, Gabriel stared at his reflection in the dark window, the soft, patient man Nora believed him to be, and beneath it, faintly visible in the glass, the shadow of Don Dragon, a man who could burn cities to protect what was his. He was beginning to understand, with dawning horror, that he could not keep both men alive forever. Sooner or later, one of them would have to die, and he was terrified of which one it would be. The tip came from a forensic accountant Gabriel trusted with his life, a quiet, meticulous woman named Priya, who had spent a decade untangling the syndicate's finances so quietly that most of his own men didn't know she existed. "I traced the clinic's payment," she told him, over an encrypted line, 3 days after the docks burned. "The account that funded your wife's procedure. It's offshore, heavily layered, designed to be untraceable by anyone who didn't know exactly where to dig. But you found it." "I found it," she confirmed, "because it connects, eventually, to one of our own shell accounts. Whoever paid for this had access to Dragon Holdings' financial infrastructure. This wasn't an outsider, Gabriel. This came from inside your organization." The words landed like a second betrayal, stacked on top of the first. Gabriel had spent weeks believing Nora's choice had been entirely her own, painful, but hers alone to make. Now, the possibility that someone close to him had helped her disappear reopened a wound he thought he'd already made peace with. There was only one man with the access, the trust, and the proximity to Nora that this required. He found Julian at the private safe house along the Lake Michigan shoreline, the same place they'd retreated to a dozen times over the years to plan strategy away from prying eyes. Julian had served the Dragon family for 15 years, first under Gabriel's father, then under Gabriel himself. He had never once given Gabriel reason to doubt him. Until now. Gabriel didn't bother with pleasantries. He crossed the room in 4 strides, gun drawn before Julian had even fully turned around, pressing the barrel beneath his old friend's jaw with a fury that shook his entire arm. "Tell me," Gabriel said, voice trembling with barely restrained violence, Why my wife's disappearance traces back to your signature on an offshore account. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon, didn't protest, didn't beg. He simply looked at Gabriel with an expression of exhausted, resigned honesty that Gabriel had never seen on him before. "Because I paid for it," Julian said quietly. "And before you pull that trigger, you should know I'd do it again. You betrayed me. I saved her," Julian shot back, the first crack of real emotion breaking through his composure. "You want to know what betrayal looks like, Gabriel? Betrayal is watching a woman fold herself smaller and smaller for 3 years, watching the light behind her eyes go out a little more every single week, and doing nothing because you're too loyal to the man responsible to say a single word. I watched her set a place for you at dinner every night for 3 years, Gabriel. Even on the nights you didn't come home, I watched her learn not to ask where you'd been. I watched her stop crying, not because she got stronger, but because she gave up expecting anything different." Gabriel's hand shook against the gun. "She never asked me for help," Julian continued, quieter now, "but I saw it building for months, and when she finally came to me, terrified and exhausted, asking if I knew anyone who could make her forget, not you, not the marriage, but the specific pain of feeling invisible in her own home, I couldn't say no. I told myself it was mercy. Maybe it was cowardice, but I did it because I believed, with everything in me, that your coldness would eventually break something in her that could never be fixed." Gabriel lowered the gun slightly, chest heaving, the fury inside him warring violently with something far more devastating, the truth. "There's something else," Julian said, and for the first time, real hesitation entered his voice. "Something you need to know, and I don't think it makes any of this easier." "Say it." Julian exhaled slowly. "Nora's family debt, the one your father used to arrange your marriage 3 years ago. It wasn't real, Gabriel. Or rather, it wasn't hers. Your father fabricated it. Manufactured a financial obligation against her family that never actually existed, specifically to force the marriage through. He wanted the Calloway name and the political connections that came with it, and he knew Nora's father would never willingly hand over his daughter otherwise." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Gabriel's feet. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that my entire marriage was built on a lie my father invented. I'm telling you that the woman you married, under threat of a debt that was never real, has spent 3 years suffering for a crime that never happened," Julian said. "She didn't owe your family anything, Gabriel. She was never obligated to marry you at all. Your father simply took her freedom the same way he took everything else he ever wanted, through force, disguised as necessity." Gabriel stood in silence for a long, unbearable moment, the gun hanging loosely at his side, the weight of his father's cruelty and his own compounding it settling over him like a shroud. Everything he'd believed about his marriage, a debt honorably settled, an obligation dutifully fulfilled, had been a manufactured lie from the very beginning. Nora hadn't married him out of necessity. She'd been stolen from a life she never should have had to give up. And he had spent 3 years punishing her with silence for a debt that had never existed. "I should end you for going behind my back," Gabriel finally said, voice hollow. "You should," Julian agreed calmly. "But you won't, because some part of you already knows I was right to do it." Gabriel holstered his weapon, the fight draining out of him entirely, replaced by something far heavier: shame, grief, and a dawning, horrifying clarity about the family legacy he'd inherited without ever questioning it. "You're stripped of your rank," Gabriel said finally, though the words carried no real venom anymore. "Effective immediately. I need you watching Valeria from a distance, quietly, without direct authority. Consider it mercy, Julian, the kind you seem so fond of giving." Julian nodded once, accepting the punishment without argument. understanding it for what it truly was, not a betrayal repaid, but the last act of loyalty Gabriel had left to offer a friend who had done something unforgivable for entirely forgivable reasons. Gabriel left the safe house that night, carrying a truth far heavier than any weapon he'd ever held. The woman he was falling in love with, as a stranger, had never truly belonged to him at all. She had simply been taken. And somewhere across the city, unaware that the ground beneath her entire marriage had just been revealed as a lie, Nora slept peacefully in the arms of a life she thought she'd chosen freely. Gabriel didn't tell Nora what he'd learned. Not about the fabricated debt, not about Julian's confession, not about the crushing weight of discovering that his entire marriage had been built on his father's cruelty rather than any real obligation she owed. He carried it silently, the same way he'd learned to carry everything. But this time, the silence wasn't cold. It was protective. He didn't want the truth to reach her yet, not until he understood what to do with it himself. Instead, he showed up the next morning at the flower shop, with an umbrella he didn't need and an offer to help her close early, since the sky had been threatening rain all afternoon. "You've been doing that a lot lately," Nora said, amused, tying her apron strings loose behind her back. "Showing up right when I need an extra pair of hands." "Maybe I'm just observant," Gabriel said. "Maybe," she echoed, smiling in a way that made something ache pleasantly in his chest. They ended up walking together through Lincoln Park, past the Botanical Gardens' iron gates, talking about nothing important. Her plans to expand the shop, his vague, half-true stories about consulting work that kept him mysteriously unavailable some evenings. The sky had been gray all day, heavy with the promise of rain, but neither of them had planned for it to break so suddenly. The first drops fell without warning, fat and cold, and within seconds, the drizzle became a full, drenching downpour. Nora laughed, grabbing his sleeve, pulling him toward the glass dome of the conservatory just ahead. They ducked inside, soaked and breathless, laughing the easy laughter of two people who had forgotten, briefly, every complicated thing weighing on them. The greenhouse was empty at this hour, humid and warm, filled with the green, earthy smell of orchids and ferns, rain drumming steadily against the glass ceiling above them. "We're going to catch a cold," Nora said, wringing water from the ends of her hair, still smiling. "Worth it," Gabriel said, and meant it more than he expected to. They wandered slowly through the empty rows of tropical plants, water dripping from their clothes onto the stone path, comfortable in a silence that had nothing tense or careful about it. Nora paused beside a cluster of night-blooming jasmine, closing her eyes briefly to breathe in the scent. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly, not opening her eyes. "Anything? You never talk about your past. Not really. Family, old relationships, you always change the subject." She opened her eyes, studying him with the same quiet perceptiveness he'd come to both love and fear. "I'm not trying to push. I just notice things." Gabriel felt the familiar instinct to deflect, to offer a practiced half-truth and steer the conversation elsewhere. But standing there, soaked and unguarded, something in him resisted the old habit. "I made terrible mistakes," he said slowly, choosing each word with unfamiliar care, "with someone I loved. I was too proud to show her any warmth, too afraid that if I let her see me as anything other than strong, I'd lose whatever control I thought I needed to survive." He swallowed hard. "By the time I understood what I was doing to her, I'd already lost her." Nora's expression softened, something aching and sympathetic passing behind her eyes. "That sounds like a painful thing to carry." "It is," he admitted. "Some days it feels like the only honest thing about me." She stepped closer, rain still dripping from the ends of her hair onto her shoulders, studying his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. "For what it's worth," she said softly, The man standing in front of me right now doesn't seem incapable of warmth at all. You don't know the man I used to be. Maybe not, she said. But I know the man you are now, and that has to count for something. The space between them had shrunk, without either of them fully noticing. The hum of rain against glass, the only sound in the warm green silence of the conservatory. Gabriel felt something dangerous and inevitable pulling them together. Not the calculated seduction he'd once used as a tool of control, but something far more vulnerable, entirely unfamiliar. Nora closed the last distance between them herself, rising slightly on her toes, and kissed him. It was nothing like the careful, obligatory affection of their marriage. No performance, no expectation, no calculated softness, meant to placate a difficult husband. It was hesitant at first, then certain, warm, rain-cooled lips, finding his with a tenderness that undid something locked tightly in his chest for years. Gabriel kissed her back slowly, one hand rising to gently cup her jaw, and for one suspended, perfect moment, the weight of his empire, his father's lies, and his own unforgivable coldness disappeared entirely. There was only the rain, the warm green silence of the greenhouse, and a woman kissing him like he was someone worth choosing freely. Because, for the first time, he actually was. When they finally parted, Nora rested her forehead lightly against his, breathless and smiling. I don't know what that was, she admitted quietly. But it didn't feel like a mistake. Gabriel closed his eyes, guilt curling sharply beneath the warmth blooming in his chest. He was falling in love with his own wife, under a stranger's name, kissing her for the first time in a marriage that had never once given her a single moment like this. Nora, he said quietly, there's things about me you don't know. There always are, she said gently, misreading the confession as simple vulnerability rather than the weight of an entire hidden identity. That's what makes getting to know someone worth it. He didn't correct her. He couldn't, not yet. Not while the truth of who he really was could shatter everything fragile and new they'd built together. Instead, he pulled her closer, resting his chin against the top of her head as the rain continued its steady rhythm against the glass, allowing himself, just for tonight, to be simply Gabe, a man capable of love, undeserving of forgiveness, and utterly unwilling to let go of the first real happiness he'd ever known. Somewhere across the city, unseen and unheard, the fragile peace they'd built was already numbered in days. Valeria Kane had not survived this long in Chicago's underworld by acting on impulse. She was patient, methodical, and ruthlessly thorough, qualities that had eventually done what months of failed raids and stolen shipments couldn't. She had found Gabriel Dragon's weakness. It started with a photograph. One of her surveillance men, tasked with watching Dragon's known associates for any sign of weakness after the docks incident, had followed Julian Voss out of habit rather than expectation. Julian, demoted and stripped of authority, had grown careless in his isolation, driving past Oak Park more often than necessary, watching over the ordinary apartment Gabriel now called home from a distance. A silent guardian nobody was supposed to notice. The photograph showed Julian's car parked outside a small flower shop. Inside the frame, blurred but unmistakable, stood Gabriel Dragon, dressed in a plain gray sweater instead of his usual tailored suits, laughing softly beside an ordinary woman with flower dust on her apron and flowers in her hands. Valeria studied the photo for a long time before she understood exactly what she was looking at. "Find out who she is," she told her intelligence chief, sliding the photograph across her desk. Everything about her now. It took less than 2 days. Nora Calloway, 29 years old, legally married to Gabriel Dragon for 3 years, though conspicuously absent from any of his public appearances or known residences for the past several weeks. A florist, unarmed, unprotected, utterly ordinary. Valeria smiled the first genuine smile she'd allowed herself in months. The terrifying Don Dragon, a man who had burned half her operation to ash without hesitation, who ruled through fear so absolute that grown men wept before his silence, had a soft spot, an Achilles heel, disguised as an unremarkable woman selling peonies in the arts district. "He's been playing house," Valeria murmured, almost admiringly. "While his empire bleeds, he's out there falling in love." She looked up at her lieutenant, eyes gleaming with cold calculation. "Prepare a team. Tonight. I want her taken alive, untouched. And I want Dragon to know exactly who has her within the hour." That night, Nora closed the shop later than usual, humming quietly to herself as she swept fallen petals from the floor, replaying the memory of the greenhouse kiss with the kind of soft, private happiness she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She didn't notice the black van parked half a block down. She didn't notice the two men slipping through the shop's back entrance until gloved hands clamped over her mouth and a cloth soaked with something sharp and chemical pressed against her nose. She fought, kicked, clawed, screamed, muffled and desperate against the gloved hand, but the drug worked fast, dragging her consciousness down into darkness before she could fully understand what was happening. Gabriel received the video feed 40 minutes later, sitting alone in his rented apartment, staring absently out the window at Nora's darkened storefront across the street, wondering why she hadn't texted to say goodnight the way she usually did. The message arrived without warning, a single video file sent from an untraceable number, accompanied by 3 words, "She's mine now." He opened it with hands that had gone completely, dangerously still. Nora, bound to a metal chair, unconscious but breathing, her head slumped forward, mascara smudged beneath closed eyes. Behind her, Valeria's face filled the frame, calm and triumphant. "Hello, Gabriel," Valeria said directly to the camera, her voice smooth as silk over broken glass. "I must admit, I never expected the terrifying Don Dragon to fall for a florist. It's almost sweet. Almost. You have 24 hours to surrender your remaining territory, your shipping routes, and your northern warehouses, or I'll return your wife to you in considerably more pieces than I currently have her in. Your choice." The video ended. Gabriel Dragon sat in absolute silence for exactly 4 seconds. Then something shattered inside him. Not panic, not the cold calculation that usually guided his decisions, but a raw, primal fury, unlike anything he had felt in his entire violent life. Every careful lesson Gabe Reyes had taught him about patience, gentleness, and restraint burned away instantly, replaced by the terrifying, absolute clarity of Don Dragon reborn. He didn't call Julian. He didn't wait for confirmation or strategy sessions. He picked up his phone and, for the first time in weeks, spoke directly to every capo, every enforcer, every soldier still loyal to the Dragon name. "Mobilize everyone," he said, voice a low, terrible calm that every man on the other end recognized instantly as absolute authority, returned in full force. Every warehouse, every safe house, every known Ken property gets hit simultaneously within the hour. I want her people scared, scattered, and unable to coordinate a single defense by the time I reach wherever they're keeping my wife. "Understood, Don Dragon," came the immediate, unquestioning reply. He tore off the plain gray sweater he'd worn for weeks, changing into the tailored black suit he hadn't touched since this entire fragile double life began, the fabric feeling simultaneously foreign and horrifyingly familiar against his skin. He strapped on weapons he'd deliberately left untouched, each motion precise, practiced, and utterly without hesitation. The soft, patient man who had learned to carry flower crates and listen, without asserting dominance, disappeared entirely, replaced by the ruthless architect of an empire built on fear. By the time Gabriel climbed into his car, tires screeching against wet pavement, as he sped toward the coordinates his tech team had already traced from Valeria's video signal, there was no trace left of Gabe Reyes at all. There was only Don Dragon, wounded, furious, and utterly without restraint, racing through a war zone of his own making to save the only person who had ever taught him how to love without needing to control. And somewhere in an abandoned industrial complex on the city's south side, unconscious and unaware of the storm rushing toward her, Nora Calloway slept in captivity, entirely unaware that the quiet, gentle man she'd fallen for and the terrifying crime lord the entire city feared were about to become, violently and irreversibly, the exact same person. The abandoned meatpacking plant sat like a rotting carcass on the edge of South Chicago, its rusted signage barely legible beneath decades of grime. Valeria had chosen it well, isolated, defensible, surrounded by empty lots that offered no cover for an approaching enemy. Gabriel didn't care. He arrived alone, ahead of his men, driven by something far more urgent than tactical patience. His enforcers were still 15 minutes out, still finishing their coordinated assault on Valeria's scattered properties across the city. Gabriel didn't wait for them. He couldn't. He breached the side entrance with a crowbar and raw fury, taking down the first guard before the man even registered movement in the shadows. The second guard got one shot off before Gabriel's return fire ended him. A graze along Gabriel's shoulder, hot and immediate, blood soaking quickly through his suit jacket. He didn't slow down. The plant's interior was a maze of rusted machinery and rotting catwalks, dim emergency lighting casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete floor. Gabriel moved through it with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent his entire life training for exactly this kind of violence, taking down Valeria's remaining guards one by one, absorbing a second bullet along his side that sent white-hot pain lancing through his ribs. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Every closed door he kicked open, every guard he eliminated, brought him closer to a single locked room at the end of the corridor, guarded by two men who fell in seconds beneath his relentless assault. He found her tied to a metal chair in the center of an empty freezer room, wrists bound, a strip of cloth gagging her mouth, her eyes wide with terror the moment she saw him burst through the door, gun raised, blood soaking through his torn suit jacket. Nora. Her name broke from him, raw and desperate, as he crossed the room in seconds, dropping to his knees to untie the cloth from her mouth with shaking, blood-slicked hands. "Gabe," she gasped, then froze, staring at the gun in his hand, the blood on his shoulder, the cold, lethal precision in his every movement that had nothing to do with the gentle man she'd fallen in love with. Who are you?" There was no time to answer. Gunfire erupted in the corridor behind them, Valeria's remaining forces converging on the freezer room, drawn by the chaos of their fallen comrades. Gabriel spun, firing through the doorway, taking cover behind the metal chair as he worked frantically at the ropes binding Nora's wrists. The gunfire, the shouting, the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood filling the small freezer room created a kind of sensory violence Nora's mind had never been designed to withstand. Her heart pounded, adrenaline flooding her system, every suppressed instinct screaming through a fog of chemical sedation and raw terror. And somewhere in that overwhelming collision of fear and chaos, something deep inside her mind, something carefully, deliberately locked away 11 days ago in a sterile clinic room, shattered open. It didn't return as she might have expected. It didn't unlock 3 years of cold silences, empty dinners, or the slow, suffocating loneliness that had driven her to erase Gabriel entirely. Instead, the trauma triggered something far older, buried beneath even the memories she'd chosen to lose. A memory from 5 years ago, before the marriage, before the debt her father-in-law had fabricated. Before any of it, she saw it clearly, vividly, as if she were living it again in real time. A rain-slicked country road outside her family's farm, a car wrapped around a tree, and a young, bleeding man stumbling from the wreckage with federal agents' spotlights sweeping through the darkness behind him. She remembered pulling him into her family's storm cellar, pressing a torn strip of her own shirt against a bleeding wound in his side, whispering for him to stay quiet while the agents searched the property above them. She remembered the way he'd looked at her that night, not with the cold, guarded eyes of the dawn dragon the world feared, but with raw, desperate gratitude. A young man barely into his 20s, terrified and vulnerable, in a way he would never let anyone see again. "Why are you helping me?" He'd whispered that night 5 years ago, blood soaking through her makeshift bandage. "Because everyone deserves a chance," she'd answered, young and unafraid, cradling a stranger's bleeding body in the darkness of her family's cellar. She hadn't known his name then. She hadn't known he would return 2 years later with her father's manufactured debt in hand, claiming her as a bride under obligations that had never actually existed. She hadn't known the boy she'd saved would become the man who broke her so completely she'd pay to forget him entirely. But she had loved him, long before their forced marriage, long before 3 years of icy silence destroyed whatever fragile connection they might have built. "Nora!" Gabriel's voice cut through the memory, desperate, as another burst of gunfire forced him to duck lower behind the chair. "Stay with me. I need you to stay with me." Her eyes refocused on his face, bleeding, terrified, achingly familiar, in a way that suddenly reached far deeper than the weeks she'd known Gabe Reyes. "You're him," she whispered, voice trembling with the weight of dual recognition crashing together at once. "You're the boy from the cellar. 5 years ago, I hid you from federal agents in my family's storm cellar." Gabriel's hands stilled on the ropes, shock freezing his features, despite the chaos exploding around them. "You remember that?" "I remember that," she said, breathless. "But not—" She stopped, something darker and more painful flickering behind her eyes as fragments of the marriage itself began pressing at the edges of her restored memory, threatening to surface entirely. "Gabriel, oh God, Gabriel Dragon." The final rope gave way beneath his trembling fingers, just as Valeria stepped through the doorway, gun raised, a cold, triumphant smile spreading across her face at the sight of Gabriel, wounded, exposed, and utterly cornered. "How touching," Valeria said, aiming her weapon directly at Gabriel's head as he knelt, defenseless, beside the woman he'd fought his entire empire to save. A reunion cut tragically short. Valeria's gun hovered inches from Gabriel's temple, her finger resting steady against the trigger, savoring the moment the way a predator savors the final second before a kill. "You should have surrendered your territory," she said, almost gently and calm. "Instead, you burned 3 of my safe houses to the ground tonight and finished 9 of my men to get here. All for a woman who, from what I understand, didn't even remember your name until an hour ago." She glanced at Nora, still bound at the wrists, though the ropes had loosened, her expression flickering with something between curiosity and contempt. "Tell me, Florist, was he worth all this bloodshed?" Nora didn't answer with words. The old Nora, the one who had spent 3 years learning to shrink herself smaller in the face of danger, who had endured silence rather than confrontation, might have frozen, might have begged, might have simply closed her eyes and waited for whatever came next. But the woman kneeling in that freezer room was no longer only that Nora. She carried, now, the fragmented memory of a girl who had once dragged a bleeding stranger to safety without hesitation, who had faced down federal agents at 19 without flinching. And beneath that, buried deeper than even Valeria could imagine, she carried 3 years of quiet, careful observation as Gabriel Dragon's wife. Nights spent unable to sleep while he took calls in the next room, fragments of overheard conversations about weak points, escape routes, contingency plans. She had never consciously understood what she was absorbing. She understood it now. Her eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, to the wall behind Valeria, to a rusted red lever marked, in faded stenciled letters, "Emergency Steam Release." She remembered, with sudden and startling clarity, an overheard conversation from years ago, Gabriel explaining to Julian, in the careful, clinical tone he used for strategy, that old meatpacking plants like this one still ran residual pressure through their processing lines, a safety hazard nobody had bothered decommissioning. Enough pressure built up in those old pipes could blind a man for several seconds if released suddenly, he'd said, not to her, never to her, but she had been sitting 3 rooms away, invisible as always, absorbing every word. She had been invisible for 3 years. Now, finally, that invisibility would matter. He was worth it, Nora said quietly, drawing Valeria's attention fully toward her, buying the half-second Gabriel needed without either of them realizing it, because he learned something you never will. "And what's that?" Valeria asked, almost amused. That power built on fear always leaves a blind spot. Nora lunged sideways, her bound wrist slamming down against the rusted lever with every ounce of strength she had left. The mechanism, decades old and never properly maintained, groaned violently before releasing a deafening blast of scalding steam directly across the room, engulfing Valeria in a white, blinding cloud. Valeria screamed, stumbling backward, her gun firing wildly into the ceiling as the pressurized steam seared across her face and arms, her vision instantly and violently stolen from her. Gabriel didn't hesitate. Wounded, bleeding, running on nothing but adrenaline and the desperate need to protect the one thing he'd finally learned mattered more than his empire, he surged forward through the steam, tackling Valeria against the concrete floor before she could recover. The gun skittered away, spinning into the shadows. Valeria clawed blindly, screaming curses through the pain, but Gabriel had spent his entire life training for exactly this kind of violence, and this time it was no longer about territory or pride. It was about survival. Hers, his, theirs. He disarmed her completely, pinning her wrists with brutal efficiency, and for one long, suspended moment, stared down at the woman who had tried to destroy everything he'd only just learned to want. "You should have left her out of this," Gabriel said, voice low and lethal, blood dripping from his shoulder onto Valeria's ruined, steam-scalded face. "She's the reason you're weak now," Valeria spat, still blind, still defiant even in defeat. "You could have ruled this city without mercy. Instead, you fell in love with the one thing capable of destroying you." Gabriel's grip tightened, and for a fraction of a second, the old Dawn Dragon, the one who solved every problem with permanent, brutal finality, considered ending her life right there on the concrete floor. Instead, he looked back at Nora, still trembling but upright, her wrists finally free, watching him with wide, frightened but steady eyes. The woman who had just saved his life, using nothing but memory, cunning, and a single overheard conversation from a marriage built on silence. He made his choice. Gabriel struck Valeria hard enough to end the fight without ending her life, leaving her unconscious and disarmed on the concrete floor, just as the sound of his arriving enforcers thundered through the corridor outside. Gunfire and shouting signaling the final collapse of Kane's remaining resistance across the city. His men flooded into the freezer room moments later, weapons raised, expressions shifting from battle readiness to visible shock at the sight of their dawn, bleeding from 2 gunshot wounds, kneeling beside an unconscious rival, and a terrified but very much alive woman none of them had ever seen before. "Secure her," Gabriel ordered, voice hoarse with exhaustion and pain, gesturing toward Valeria's unconscious form. "Alive. She answers for tonight through the organization's channels, not a bullet." His men obeyed instantly, and for the first time in weeks, Gabriel allowed himself to sag, the adrenaline finally draining from his body as the full weight of his injuries crashed down at once. His vision swam, blood loss finally catching up to him, the concrete floor tilting dangerously beneath his knees. "Gabriel!" Nora's voice reached him through the haze, her hands suddenly bracing his shoulders, holding him upright with a strength that surprised them both. "Stay with me. You don't get to save my life and then bleed out on this floor." He managed a weak, exhausted smile despite the pain radiating through his side. "Bossy," he murmured, "for someone who just learned my last name." "I remember more than my last name," she said quietly, her expression a complicated tangle of relief, grief, and something achingly tender. "I remember all of it now, Gabriel. Everything." His smile faded slightly, replaced by fear far sharper than any bullet wound. "All of it," he repeated softly, understanding immediately what that meant. The cellar, the wedding, the debt, and 3 years of cold, suffocating silence he could never take back. Before he could say another word, exhaustion and blood loss finally claimed him, and Gabriel Dragan collapsed into darkness, leaving Nora kneeling beside him in the wreckage of the war he'd fought entirely for her, now carrying the full, unbearable weight of remembering exactly who he used to be. Gabriel woke slowly, the world arriving in fragments, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the steady beep of a heart monitor, sunlight filtering weakly through half-closed blinds. Pain radiated dull and distant from his shoulder and side, dulled by whatever medication dripped steadily into his arm. It took him a long moment to remember why he was here, and when he did, panic seized him before his eyes had even fully adjusted to the light. Nora. He turned his head too quickly, pain lancing through his ribs, and found her sitting in a chair beside his bed, exactly where he needed her to be. Not gone, not fled the moment she'd remembered everything, still there, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Exhaustion, grief, and something else beneath it, quieter and more complicated. "You're awake," she said softly. 3 weeks. You've been in and out, mostly out. Infection set in after the surgery, but you pulled through. 3 weeks. He'd lost 3 weeks lying unconscious, and she had stayed through every single day of it. "Nora." His voice came out cracked, hoarse. "You remember everything now." It wasn't a question. He could see it in her eyes, no longer the polite, careful blankness of a stranger, nor the warm, unguarded trust of a woman falling for someone named Gabe. Something far heavier sat behind her gaze now, layered with the full weight of 3 years, alongside the memory of who he'd once been to her before any of it. "Everything," she confirmed quietly. "The wedding you barely looked at me during. The dinners where you didn't speak more than 10 words. The nights you didn't come home. And I never asked where you'd been, because I already knew I wouldn't like the answer." She paused, swallowing hard. "And the cellar. 5 years ago. A boy bleeding out on my family's floor, terrified and human in a way I never saw again, until Gabe Reyes showed up outside my flower shop." Gabriel closed his eyes briefly, bracing himself for what he knew had to come next. The anger, the grief, the goodbye he'd been dreading since the moment he'd understood the depth of his own cruelty. "I know what I did to you," he said, forcing the words out before she could speak first. "I know the debt was never real. Julian told me everything. My father manufactured it to force the marriage through, and I never once questioned it. Never once wondered if you'd been given a choice. His voice broke slightly. You were never obligated to me at all, Nora. I took 3 years of your life for nothing. Nora's expression flickered with surprise. Clearly she hadn't known that particular truth yet, before settling back into the same careful, unreadable calm. That doesn't surprise me, she said finally. Somehow it explains everything, and changes nothing at the same time. I'm not asking you to forgive it, Gabriel said quickly, pain and urgency cutting through the fog of medication. I know I don't deserve that. You don't owe me anything. Not now, not ever again. Whatever you need, a divorce, your freedom, resources to rebuild your life completely separate from mine. It's yours. I'll sign whatever you want. Half of everything I own. I'll disappear from your life entirely if that's what you need to finally be free. He meant every word, and the offering of it cost him more than any wound Valeria's men had inflicted. Nora was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an intensity that made him brace for the goodbye he was certain was coming. I hated who you were, she said finally, voice steady, despite the vulnerability underneath it. Not in some abstract way, Gabriel. I hated waking up beside a man who looked at me like an obligation instead of a person. I hated 3 years of silence so complete I started talking to myself just to remember what my own voice sounded like. I hated it enough to pay a stranger to erase you from my mind entirely, rather than spend one more day hoping you'd eventually notice I existed. Each word landed like a blade, precise and deserved, and Gabriel accepted every one without flinching. But, she continued, quieter now, the man who moved into an apartment across the street from a woman he thought had forgotten him, who learned to carry flower crates and ask questions and actually listen to the answers. That man took 2 bullets, walking into a building full of armed men, because he couldn't bear the thought of losing me. That man learned, somehow, in a matter of weeks, how to love gently in a way the husband I married for 3 years never once managed. She reached out, carefully, and took his hand, the first deliberate touch she'd offered since he'd woken. I don't know if you're the same person, she admitted. I've spent 3 weeks sitting in this chair, trying to decide if Gabriel Dragan and Gabe Reyes are truly the same man, or if loving one means forgiving crimes committed by the other. And what did you decide? Gabriel asked, barely daring to breathe. That it doesn't matter which one you were, Nora said, only which one you choose to be from now on. Her grip tightened slightly around his hand. I'm not the same woman who married you 3 years ago either, Gabriel. I know things now, about strength, about what I deserve, about how to survive when everything I trusted disappears overnight. I won't go back to being invisible, not for you, not for anyone. I don't want you invisible, Gabriel said fiercely. I want... He stopped, forcing himself to slow down, to be honest instead of desperate. I want to spend whatever time you'll give me, proving that the man who learned to love you gently is the only man I intend to be from now on. Nora studied him for a long, searching moment, before finally, carefully, nodding. I'll stay, she said, but under one condition, Gabriel, one absolute, non-negotiable condition. Anything. Her expression hardened, steady and unwavering, despite the quiet vulnerability still lingering beneath it. The mob boss has to die, she said. Not metaphorically, not just retired quietly into the shadows while you keep one foot in that world forever. Gabriel Dragan, the Don, the man who solves problems with bullets and rules an empire through fear. He has to disappear completely. Or I walk away, and this time, I won't need a clinic to help me forget you. It took 4 months to die properly. Faking the death of a man like Gabriel Dragan wasn't as simple as vanishing overnight. Not without inviting a war of succession that would tear apart everything he'd spent his life building, and everyone still loyal to him along with it. It required patience, precision, and exactly the kind of quiet, careful planning that Julian Voss, reinstated and trusted once more, excelled at. They spent those 4 months constructing the ending the world would believe. Dragon Holdings was gradually restructured, its more legitimate shipping and logistics operations legally transferred into a foundation Gabriel quietly funded, but never publicly claimed. The criminal infrastructure, the drugs, the extortion, the brutal enforcement that had defined 3 generations of his family, was dismantled piece by piece, some of it handed over to federal investigators through anonymous tips that conveniently avoided implicating anyone still willing to walk away clean. Valeria, recovering in federal custody from injuries that had cost her the sight in one eye, never spoke a word about the man who'd spared her life in that freezer room. Some debts, apparently, were paid in silence rather than blood. Julian orchestrated the final act himself. A car, rigged with precision, detonated on a stretch of empty highway outside the city, timed perfectly to be discovered by the exact investigators who had spent a decade trying to build a case against Don Dragon. Dental records, quietly falsified. A body sourced through channels nobody would ever trace. The evidence was flawless. The story simple. Gabriel Dragon, feared crime lord of Chicago's South Side, finished in an explosion suspected to be retaliation from a rival organization already crumbling under its own internal chaos. The news broke on a gray Tuesday morning, splashed across local headlines with the kind of grim finality reserved for men whose death surprised absolutely no one in their line of work. Don Dragon finished in car explosion. City's underworld braces for power vacuum. Julian gave a brief, appropriately somber statement to the handful of reporters who bothered showing up, then quietly began reshaping what remained of the organization into something smaller, cleaner, and considerably less interested in expansion. He answered to no counsel, feared no rivals, and made peace, slowly, with running a legacy stripped down to something almost unrecognizable from what it had once been. Thousands of miles away, in a small coastal town somewhere along the Pacific Northwest where the fog rolled in thick most mornings and the air smelled permanently of salt and pine, a man named Gabe worked quietly in a small plant nursery overlooking the ocean. He didn't carry a gun anymore. He didn't answer to titles, didn't flinch at unexpected knocks on the door, didn't wake in the middle of the night bracing for news of burning docks or betrayed alliances. His hands, once calloused from gripping weapons and signing death warrants, disguised as business decisions, had grown calloused instead from soil and clay pots and the patient, unglamorous work of coaxing things to grow. Nora ran the front of the shop. A modest storefront with hand-painted lettering, not unlike the one where this entire impossible story had begun, while Gabe handled the greenhouse in the back, tending seedlings with the same careful attention he'd once given to strategy and violence. The locals knew them simply as a quiet couple who'd moved to town 8 months ago, kept mostly to themselves, and sold the healthiest tomato starts and prettiest hydrangeas in 3 counties. Some mornings, standing in the damp, earthy quiet of the greenhouse before the shop opened, Gabriel allowed himself to think about the man he used to be. Not with nostalgia. He felt no longing for the fear he'd once commanded, no ache for the power that had cost him 3 years of Nora's life before he even understood what he'd taken. But he thought of it the way a person thinks of a fever finally broken, grateful mostly for the clarity that came after. He thought about his father, dead for over a decade now, who had built an empire on lies and cruelty, and passed both down as inheritance without ever once questioning whether either was worth keeping. He thought about the debt that had never existed, the marriage built on manufactured obligation, and the 3 years of silence that had nearly cost him the only thing that ever mattered. And he thought about the woman working just beyond the greenhouse door, humming softly to herself while she arranged fresh-cut flowers for the morning's first customers. A woman who had once erased him entirely from her memory, rather than endure one more day beside a man incapable of showing her warmth, and who had chosen, against every reasonable instinct, to stay anyway once she understood exactly who he'd become. "You're doing that thing again," Nora said, appearing in the doorway between the greenhouse and the shop, wiping soil from her hands onto her apron, watching him with the same warm, familiar affection that had somehow survived every impossible thing they'd both endured. Standing there thinking too hard about something. "Just grateful," Gabriel said simply, and meant it more completely than he'd ever meant anything in his old life. "For the tomatoes?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "For all of it," he said, "even the parts that nearly destroyed us." Nora crossed the small space between them, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the gray morning fog roll slowly off the water outside their small greenhouse window. "Julian called last night," she said quietly. "Everything's stable. Nobody's looking for Gabriel Dragon anymore. Nobody ever will again." "Good," Gabriel murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. He was never worth saving anyway. Outside, the tide continued its endless rhythm against the shore, indifferent to empires risen and fallen, to men reborn through loss rather than triumph. Inside the small greenhouse, surrounded by seedlings and soil and the quiet, unremarkable rhythm of an ordinary life neither of them had ever expected to deserve, Gabriel Dragon understood, finally and completely, that losing everything he thought he wanted had been the only thing capable of giving him everything he actually needed. The mob boss was dead. The man who remained had never been more alive.